Spider-Man's adventures in the UK, love in the time of coronavirus, and armchair travel during a pandemic. I'm Alicia Underling Nelson, and this is Travel Tomorrow, the podcast about how travel trends influence our everyday lives, whether we travel or not. And right now, we're focusing on the not part of that equation, since the coronavirus has changed the world completely in just a few weeks. My co-host, Joe Bauer, joins us from Berlin. How is the mood in Berlin? How's everybody feeling?
I can't speak to everybody because I don't speak to everybody. Not everybody wants to talk to me, believe it or not. A shame. And exactly, that's what I tell myself to get through the nights, the lonely, scary nights. But I think the mood is generally okay. We've been fortunate that we haven't shut everything down, so we can still go for walks. We can go do exercise and stuff. And I was exchanging messages with my cousin in Israel, and she was showing video, like, they literally cannot leave, like, their block. And it was just Passover, and she showed me that they came out, all of her neighbors came out, and they were singing a Passover song, and the cops came, like, wondering what the hell is going on, and I think they actually ended up being told to please go back inside, so it's, like, very stringent there. And of course, I spoke with today's guests, Lindsey Tramuta, about inevitably that comes up, and things are very shut down there. At the time that we spoke, she hadn't been outside for 2 days. So very fortunate to have a little bit of freedom still going on here in Berlin. But what's it like out there in Fargo?
North Dakota's doing okay. We have quite a lot of testing per capita, and we're a pretty rural state. So the population centers, things are a little bit stricter, but we don't have a strict shelter in place yet either, because we've had a lot of our businesses and schools closed for quite a while, and our numbers are holding steady. We've not had, you see that graph rising and rising and rising. We've not had that yet, so we're feeling like we're doing okay. So I think the mood is cautiously optimistic. We're still able to go out. We've been trying to get takeout orders to support our favorite local restaurants to keep them going, and we're still able to walk around the neighborhood and do that kind of thing. So it's been good.
Well, that's good.
I think everybody's adjusting and doing the best they can.
But more importantly, let's address the elephant in the room. You sound like you're trying to sell cigarettes from the 1920s. Would you care to explain?
I would. I'm a little bit raspy today, and that's because I'm recovering from pneumonia and probably influenza too. I have been sick essentially since a couple hours after we did our last podcast. And I had no voice at all for about 2 weeks. I got to have the COVID-19 test by a nurse in the hazmat suit and everything. So I had a very surreal experience, but thankfully that was negative. I just seemed to get everything else. So yeah, there was a time a couple weeks ago where it was all I could do to prop myself up in my chair, but I'm way better now. I just sound awful.
I still think you should use this opportunity to launch your 1920s jazz singer career, like, it's Corona time, baby. Let's get crazy. Dun, 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 dun.
I need a name. I need like a dame name from the 20s, like Edie or something.
That sounds like if we were super social media savvy, that sounds like the thing we would tell people to do, is to give Alicia her coronavirus, but not coronavirus, her pneumonia, influenza.
My pneumonia name.
Yeah, your pneumonia, 1920s smoky jazz singer name. That would be a task that we would put out to the people. We still can. Maybe we'll remember to do it by the time we're done recording.
I think we should. My husband thinks it's hilarious. There was also a time a couple weeks ago where I did not sound even like a woman at all. I sounded like a really crabby, raspy old man. So I'd be like, hey, I'll talk to my kid, and I'm like, get that out of here. And he's like, what?
That's fine. Sometimes I recognize you as a raspy old man, and so that's fine if you want to slip into that identity. I support that.
You're totally rubbing off on me. This is your inner self coming out. Great.
That's what's happening in the world.
Thanks.
It's like we said last time. People have been brought down to my general level of pessimism, so it's like I'm actually like kind of rising above the tide a little bit in my mood, whereas everybody's getting brought down and, being the cranky old man for once. I'm free at last.
I don't think everybody's necessarily cranky, though. I just contributed to a story I can link to it in our show notes. A blogger here in the Midwest asked people to send in images that people are submitting or putting in their windows and on their doors to kind of cheer up their neighbors. So there's all these pictures of hearts and rainbows, and I can just imagine you like.
I was gonna say that I'm starting to get cranky again thinking about it. Hearts and
teddy
rainbows,
bears and Easter eggs.
Teddy bears, Easter eggs. That could be an omelet.
It's sweet though, and like you've got a bunch of kids at home. They want to do something. They want to cheer up their neighbors. And I'll tell you what. I now that I can actually like physically walk more than to get my mail, I've been walking around my neighborhood, and it's nice to see these little signs of hope because the neighborhoods are pretty quiet. You'll see people out walking their dogs, and you have to cross the street to allow distance and everything. But I don't know. I think it's kind of nice to see these signs of life that we're all there. We're all sticking together.
Yeah. Well, before you lose your voice even more, should you go ahead and take us over to our first stop? I think you should.
I'll do that.
Now boarding.
This is another one of those signs of hope. In late March, quarantined children in Stockport, England, reported spotting Spider-Man running and exercising outside their windows. And Spider-Man is actually the work of two friends, Andrew Baldock and Jason Baird, who are using their hour of daily outdoor exercise to dress up in full Spider-Man costume and entertain the neighborhood kids who are stuck indoors. And they've been doing it since the second week of social distancing, so they're pretty far into this now, and it's kind of becoming a thing and a tradition. And the kids are making signs and putting them in their windows, asking Spidey to come visit them, and some of them are even dressing up themselves, which is really cute. And there's a Facebook group called Stockport Spider-Men that provides clues to where the superheroes will be exercising and moving around the city. And it also informed residents that the Easter Bunny is going to be making an appearance, or did make an appearance, which is fun. And Spider-Man wants to remind everyone, including the Easter Bunny, that they should practice social distancing like he does, which I think is really cute. Like, I'm sorry, I'm stuck inside with a 6-year-old, and I will take any kind of entertainment that we can get, because right now, school is screens. All he wants to do is screens. And I don't know, we need some actual human-to-human interaction. So I'll take it.
Or human-to-bunny.
Well done, Spidey.
In the Easter Bunny case, it sounds like.
The Easter Bunny's a little creepy.
A little creepy? Please. It's nightmarish. I'm surprised that after they made the Leprechaun horror franchise, that they didn't just immediately think, well, Easter Bunny, that's the next logical conclusion for a horror franchise, and I expect that to be what comes out of this virus pandemic. Somebody's writing that movie right now.
The Easter Bunny horror film.
Yeah.
I hope we get a credit for inspiring it.
I would certainly like to do that, and I would certainly like to see the money come in from that, but the Easter Bunny is so terrifically horrific and is inspired so many nightmares in children, I'm certain of it, that I can't believe we're the only ones who have thought of this. I think we'd have a hard time claiming copyright on that one.
Well, he's creepy because he's blank. He's just kind of like, he just has like weird...
It's a man.
Dead eyes.
It's a lonely old
weird.
Man in a bunny outfit going to children's homes to give them the eggs that apparently a rabbit lays. It's terrifying.
Our governor actually named the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny as essential employees, so they are still able to make their deliveries as long as they practice their social distancing and disinfect.
What you just heard was an audible eye roll. Now you're bringing. I just started this thing saying how I'm the upbeat, optimistic one in all of this, and now you're finding the stories to make me sound cranky again.
It can only last so long.
Yeah.
Speaking of stories, why don't you take us to our main interview?
Absolutely. I interviewed Lindsey Tramuta, author of The New Paris, The People, Places, and Ideas Fueling a Movement, and The New Parisienne, The Women and Ideas Shaping Paris, about how good writing can transport us to places we've never been. And I started by asking her how readers can armchair travel at a time like this through a book like The New Paris.
This is a really interesting time, for a plethora of reasons, but I think it would be wrong to assume everybody suddenly has heaps of time because, many of us are still working. But in the hours that we're not working, there are people that are turning to cooking and might be playing around with cookbooks that document cuisines from, other cultures, which is a good way to armchair travel. In a sense, it doesn't necessarily require, sitting down and reading like a normal book, but it's a way to transport yourself. And so, of course, if people have books on French cooking, it's a good time to sort of dive in and play around. But also, if cooking is not your thing and you don't want to be reading the news, then it's a good time to sit down with maybe that stack of books that you have that maybe take place in Paris or take place elsewhere in France. Even if it's tangentially related to Paris, it would be a good moment to put yourself somewhere else. I know I'm doing the same with other types of books. And it's just preparing us for what will come next. So hopefully that means we'll be able to travel again. It'll get us inspired, maybe get us motivated to seek out something new when we do get to travel again. But whether it's through cooking or fiction or nonfiction, I mean, there's so many options out there. And I know some people who are looking for new, to purchase new books. Depending on where they live, that's becoming a little bit of a challenge. But you can get digital books. There are audiobooks, so it's really like an interesting time to double down on reading in general, and whatever format that might be and might compel you to read the most.
Well, since you mentioned that you're reading some books, I'm curious, what books are you reading that are transporting you to someplace else right now? And then off of that, how do you believe travel writing puts us in a specific place?
Well, travel writing is all about creating a sense of place in general. So that's going to be through vivid description or, bringing people into a culture that's unlike their own. I don't necessarily do a lot of the very narrative form travel writing that you see, sort of these long, very detailed features that, describe everything from the smell in the air. I tend to do sort of, I'm very interested in the people doing things in France, for example. And so I like to tell their stories more than I like to necessarily set up the whole Parisian scene. I mean, I in any case, we all do it in our own way. But I think that it's through a certain type of picture that you paint for people. So in terms of the books that I'm reading and plan to read, there's one called I think it's called The Diary of a Bookseller. And I bought it ages ago, and it's about a bookseller who is in Scotland, and sort of like the trials and tribulations of owning a bookstore, which is suddenly very timely because, obviously it's been timely at many times given, how indies are always up against Amazon and other, mega retailers, but it's timely again for much different reasons. And so I was sort of drawn to it because, I'm in the publishing world and I'm watching independent bookstores all over announce closures or announce layoffs or, how they're sort of weathering this storm. But also this book takes place in Scotland, which puts me somewhere else. Even if it's, again, not, really elaborate in the description of Scotland, but it's still outside of my normal environment. And then I'm reading Machines Like Me by Ian McEwan. It's his new book. And it takes place in like an alternative 1980s London, where actually it's very technologically advanced, but there's still description of London and the areas around it. And so it's, again, not a traditional travel novel, but it does put me outside of my normal environment.
But I don't think it's interesting that you're reading books that aren't traditional travel literature, because I agree that you don't need necessarily a book to be, Jane Doe or whatever traveling to this country and here's her experiences. Like, one of the most vivid pieces of travel writing that probably wasn't even intended as travel writing I could think of was I forget the name, but it's basically about a Japanese couple and their cat. And it's,
oh yeah, I know those series. Yeah.
So like, I mean, and that gave me, and I read that on my way to Japan back when such a thing was possible. And, that I felt gave me more into like a Japanese mindset and culture than if I did read something that was like, Carl is hiking across Japan, follow along Carl's adventures in some book or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But it's interesting because I've gotten a few messages from different readers who have picked my book, The New Paris, back up again and are reading it because they actually had travel scheduled to come to Paris. And so they're using the book as a way to sort of like fill that hole. And maybe they were also planning on reading it as research, but there are still stories in there. And so that's been very interesting to see as well, because, or to learn that people are picking it up for that reason. And I think that's also a testament to the sort of enduring appeal of Paris.
Is that something that makes me want to jump back to something I was going to ask earlier about the new Paris? Did you set out to make this something that people could read and feel like they're in Paris, or was that kind of a happy accident? Because when I read it, and I had not been to Paris before at the time, but when I read it, I definitely felt like, oh, these are the neighborhoods I want to go to, because I like the feeling I'm getting just by reading about them and reading about the interviews that you had with certain individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I knew that I needed to make a case anyway for why people should spend more time in these other areas. And so in order to do that, I had to provide some sort of a, travel-y setup in terms of, the environment I'm painting. And so it wasn't completely by chance, but I think I don't think I expected people to take to it in the way that they have, which is obviously a wonderful, wonderful outcome. But it's good feedback to have, because you hope you're going about it in the right way. You hope you're painting the picture the right way, and then you just have to wait and see.
Well, if people are picking up your book in lieu of being able to go to Paris, I think that speaks pretty highly to your ability to transport somebody to Paris. So that's
hey, I will take that as a high compliment. I'm really
it is a high
about
compliment. Well, then I want to talk a little bit about how Paris is traditionally described in travel writing. You have this great line that I want to read from the book. Yeah, so we've come prepared. The trouble with such an internationally fetishized public image, though, is that the city becomes a prisoner to its own defied history, hemmed in by its former successes. And that's just like a beautiful line. I could never write something like that. It just, so many great words, hemmed in by this former, I just love the line. And so I was wondering, how do you believe good writing can honor a place's classic image and attractions without necessarily resorting to cliche?
Well, I think it's about word choice. I mean, we see a certain selection of words that come up time and time again when we're reading about Paris, just like when you're reading about, a lot of places in Italy too. And I think the first step is to, write that list of words to avoid. And actually, when you write for travel magazines, they have certain phrases and idioms that they want you to avoid, because, you think it's playful, or you might think it's playful, but they're actually like, no, this isn't sophisticated enough. And so, or it just sort of oversimplifies a destination. And I think people use those expressions because they're not thinking or projecting themselves into the real place, and to come up with a series of other, words, descriptions, to really paint it the way it should be painted. I've used that expression now a million times already in this conversation. I'm sorry, but
that's okay. Paint away.
But I think it comes down to that. I think it's like, you want people to understand the place you're describing. And so you resort to things, like certain cliches that will be familiar to people, but ultimately that oversimplifies a place. So the trick is coming up with a whole other, sort of set of words and descriptions and ideas to tell a similar story, if that's what you're trying to do. Tell a story about, let's say, classic Paris. Well, what are some of the other ways around, what are the ways to tell that story without going through the same formula? And so I think that's what, I was trying to do in terms of making a comparison also between old and new Paris. I mean, you can do it in very, very simple ways. People are always like, oh yes, there's a lot of graffiti. It's like, okay, but that's a very surface level difference between old and new Paris, And so the other thing is that it does require having a really good sense of place. So I've been here for almost 14 years. I mean, and when I wrote it, it was obviously, it was about 2015 when I was writing it. So, it had been, over 10 years, but still that's like built up observations and an understanding of the ways in which Paris culturally often grapples with its past. So you can't just, put a statement out there about a place if if it doesn't really come from reality.
Yeah, and you're
And it
certainly no
doesn't
longer a
reflect.
tourist.
No, no. And I mean, that doesn't delegitimize tourist observations, but it does mean that, if I'm going to read about the way Berlin has changed over the years, I'm going to want someone who's really seen the way it's evolved
Mm-hmm.
to tell me that story. So I think, it comes from an honest place when people resort to, cliches and things like that, but it does a destination, and it does a story a disservice ultimately.
Right. And then I also want to talk a little bit about your upcoming book, which is still coming out. I know it got pushed back a little bit. When's it coming out now?
Yeah. So it was supposed to be April 21st. It's now July 7th, which frankly, I'm a little bit relieved about, because I mean, that does give us a little bit more time to figure out how things are going to go. But, it's uncertain still. No one knows what they're doing. It's like we're all walking blind through a dark forest. No one knows.
Right. This one, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's focusing on the impact women are having on Paris, from the mayor to the individual activist. And
Mm-hmm.
so that might not necessarily seem like travel literature, but I'm wondering if you think that readers are nonetheless going to be able to get a sense that they're traveling to Paris through the stories of these women you're featuring.
For sure, because first of all of the women, through whether it's interviews, so it's a mix of profiles and interviews. So um, through either format, you're getting a sense of, the neighborhood they live in, or where they grew up, and, maybe where their office is located. And then at the end of each feature on a woman, I have a section called Her Paris. And so I ask a series of questions, like, their favorite woman-run business, where they go to sort of relax, or when they want to, get out of a work mode, where do they go on weekends. And so in the end, there's a compilation of different places and ideas for experiencing Paris. So there is still a travel component that was still very important, but it is just sort of discovering Paris through the lens of a whole series of women who not all of them are well known, but they're shaping the city in some way.
Well, that sounds great. I'm really excited to get into it once it comes out. And I'm actually probably gonna gift it for my wife, so that we both have it. So like a present for her, but also present for me.
That's the best kind.
Yeah. No, I lean on that a little bit more than I probably should.
Hey, it's still a nice gesture.
Yeah, and it's pandemic time, so anything goes.
Yeah, it's true.
Last thing I wanted to ask you about before we go, circling back to just a general discussion of travel writing. Right now, we can't travel. We're not supposed to travel, even if some people can or are, when we should be staying at home. So how do you believe travel writing can fill that void for that desire to travel?
I think it's going to be, at least temporarily, a lot about sort of recalling the places we've been, and maybe imagining the places we still want to go. And there's still a lot of imagination that we can draw from to do that, and a lot of existing research. I mean, to be determined how this is going to shape the next several months of travel writing. But if you look at magazines that cover hotels, for example, well, it's going to be a bit tricky if we can't physically visit these places. But maybe the stories that are more broad, more narrative, about, I don't know, discovering a certain population in South America, or a type of cuisine. Well, there will still be people who can tell those stories, who have been and can find a new way to spin it. So maybe it's the place I want to visit as soon as this is over, and I'm returning to this place that I loved, and here's how, so drawing from some sort of experience. I mean, I was asked to do that for a publication, and it should be coming out in the next week or so, I guess. And it was essentially like, what are you daydreaming about right now? And sort of a similar question is like, where would you go if you could take a train tomorrow? Where would you be going? And it's an interesting exercise, because actually my answer was much different than I would have expected. Yes, it's getting beyond Paris, because I'm now I think I'm going to need a break from Paris, at least for a weekend.
We're all going to need a break from where we live, I'm sure.
Oh God, for sure.
I love Berlin. I love where I live, but yeah, first weekend we can get out of here, I need some fresh air.
Yeah. So, that's going to be, that's a big determining factor. But I think what I did was I closed my eyes and I considered the first sort of outdoor image that came to mind. And that's what I went with. And it was surprising to me because it was unexpected. But at the same time, it's like we're in this very primal or elemental state of living. And so we need to maybe trust what our innermost desires are telling us. And how do you figure out what that is? Well, maybe just closing your eyes and letting your mind wander. And so I think that's where travel writing can take us, at least temporarily. And then hopefully we can be back on the road and telling the really important stories. But it's tricky. There's a lot that remains to be seen.
That sounds like a nice exercise, except usually when I close my eyes, it gets dark and I get terrified immediately and I open my eyes back up. But maybe I'm going to give it a second next time, see what pops up, and I think maybe that'll be our next trip post-pandemic.
Yes, give it a try.
I really liked how in your discussion you talked about how it's not necessarily even the genre of travel writing that can transport us. It can be anything that's evocative and kind of, creates that sense of place. And I think that's really true. I think sometimes people think, I don't like reading long-form journalism in travel magazines, or I don't really like short stories in the travel genre, so it's not for me. But I think you can read anything that puts you in a place and you kind of get the same benefit. And you two touched on that. And I think that's important to remember when we're going through and we're maybe looking through our bookshelves or trying to find something to read online, that we don't necessarily have to be tied to a travel guidebook or to strictly a travel book itself. There's lots of other ways to get into a place. Do you have any books like that other than the one that you and Lindsey talked about that really did that for you?
Actually, I immediately think of A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson, and we always want to call her like sister-in-law. She's kind of a sister-in-law. She was a Norwegian foreign exchange student, lived with my wife when she was in high school, has become like part of the family, so like a sister-in-law. And she bought me that book as a present. I forget when or why, but it was I think it was before she moved back to Norway or something. And I had not gotten into this kind of writing yet, of travelogue, I guess would be that genre. And I remember how I like just tore through that book, and I really felt like I was on the Appalachian Trail with him. So that was kind of the first time that I really felt that. But then, like you said, there's certainly been books. I don't know if I can rattle them off the top of my head. I read so much. I'm a very well-read individual. Anyway, I don't know if I can rattle them off the top of my head, but there are certainly a lot of books that weren't necessarily travelogue that I've read and felt like I am in this place. I mentioned the one to Lindsey, the Japanese book that basically just follows a Japanese couple and tells a story of their cat. And so there's certainly a lot of books out there like that have put me in a destination that, don't fit into the, like Amazon.com/books/travel or travelogue or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's something where you can read, something from people that actually live in a place, because we're travel writers and we do the best job we can do, I like to think, and I think that our colleagues do too.
I do a mediocre job at best.
That's very modest of you.
Well, if you say so, then fine, I'm fantastic. Go on.
But I think, every writer is going to try to be as accurate as possible. But there's always the chance that we're going to misunderstand something, that we're going to not see, we're going to see something from the outside and not really understand how it is to grow up in that tradition or to live in that neighborhood and to experience it. So I think if you can read, translations by authors that are from a place or somebody that's lived there for a long time, like Lindsey has, I think that does give you a really important, different perspective. And I think for me, like when I went to LA when I was pregnant, so almost 7 years ago, and my friend lives there, and his LA is really different than any LA I've ever seen in a travel profile. Like I felt like I didn't get it at all. And even when I went there, like LA is a kind of a neighborhood based city. Like I can go to New York, like, and I understand it. Like it's in your face. It doesn't, It doesn't hide anything. It's not trying to put a pleasant face on anything. Whereas I feel like LA was sort of like, cool, we're all friendly and chill. But like, I didn't understand it. I couldn't get a foothold anywhere. And so I felt like I went to LA, I read about LA, and I still came back like, I don't really understand this place that I've been at all. And it really wasn't until I read a couple books that weren't travel writing at all. I read City of Style, LA City of Style by Melissa, I'm going to say this wrong, Magsaysay, who's a Los Angeles Times style editor. So it's all about fashion. It shouldn't tell me anything really about the city itself. But that book, I was like, oh, I get it. Like, I kind of understand the character of these neighborhoods by the shops and the people that live there. And then I read a bunch of essays by Eve Babbitt, who is amazing. And she was kind of like a very interesting, vibrant it girl and artist who lived in LA. And so this is, I mean, her work isn't even necessarily current, but it kind of gave me like the historical underpinnings of a place. And Babbitt really writes a lot about like the mood and the vibe of the city. And it's really sensual and not, I don't know, it's not intellectual really at all. And that, like, I read those two books and I happened to just pick them up at a library sale. Like, bought them both for like 50 cents. I was like, man, finally, like, this is the key to this. And, you know, so you never know. Like, you kind of have to read broadly. Like, you never know what kind of book will transport you. And I think that's really cool as an author. You know, I write history books, but they're really, really grounded in place. So I'm always really happy when people come to me and they say, I read an article, I read your book, and I thought about this place differently. And I thought I was just reading about history, like something that was dead and gone, but it's not. And I think that's really cool, that there's lots of different ways that we can really be transported to a place without necessarily reading a neat little package on how to enjoy a weekend there. And I mean, that stuff is my bread and butter, so I'm not gonna knock it. But there's so many different ways to get into the psyche of a place.
Well, that's interesting that people have said that about your work. I should really maybe try reading some of your articles sometime.
Oh, maybe you should. Gee, what a supportive writing partner you are.
Maybe
you should read them in their final form and not their ugly form. Huh?
That's true. I hope that the joke was transferred that I actually do read a lot of your work, but that's actually true. I never really read your finished product very often. I tell you, I feel like I'm the grandmother who's like, send me your articles, send me your things, and you never send me anything. You never call, you never tell me how you're doing, you never send me your articles. What I
should clip them out and put them in an envelope for you.
There you go. And then see, now you're slipping right back into the 1920s dame.
That was intentional.
There you go.
I almost called you Ethel. I think that would be a great name for you.
Ethel?
I can be Edie and you can be Ethel. Yeah, it's great.
All right, well, I guess I got some work to get done. So should we go ahead and wrap things up? Do a little postcard, change it up from the other segments.
Our postcard today is a story of love in the time of coronavirus. And Joe, you're going to have to help me say this. Deutsche Welle?
Welle.
Is that close? Welle.
Yeah,
Deutsche Welle.
Deutsche Welle.
Deutsche Welle.
Deutsche Welle. Deutsche Welle.
That sounds Italian.
Yeah, I know. I'm just screwing with you at that point. I was doing the thing. I had this German teacher who you would say something and be like, Deutsche Welle. And she'd be like, Joe? Deutsche Welle. Joe? Deutsche Welle. Deutsche Welle. Joe. Deutsche Welle. Das ist Katastrophe Spaghetti.
She would hate me so much. I'd be in the back row wearing a dunce cap in shame in your German class.
Was that any different than any other day? Boom!
Ooh.
What did you, that's such an old reference, really, the dunce cap. I'd be in the back of the class wearing a dunce cap.
Hey, I'm a 1920s lady right now.
That's true.
That's true.
Era. That is how you would have been disciplined back then.
Absolutely. Can I do the postcard now?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, that's right. Postcard. Go ahead.
Deutsche Welle reports that romance is alive and well. Denmark citizen Inga Rasmussen, who is 85, and her German boyfriend, Karsten Hansen, who is 89. Ooh, that was kind of a Norwegian accent. They can't go on their regular dates, so they're meeting on either side of the border fence at the German border city of Aventoft every day, while practicing their social distancing, of course. So the couple chat, they drink coffee, they bring a little booze out and have a drink together. On opposite sides of the border, of course, eat lunch and trade biscuits. And it's really sweet. And they were spotted by a local mayor who was out riding his bike And now this couple's date has gone viral in a good way, not a coronavirus way. And they're totally internet famous. And it must be very strange for them, but it's great because this is the kind of story that we need to hear more of, I think.
Yeah, actually, I have seen more of these stories since I found that original link that on the German-Swiss border. My wife showed me that there are other couples doing the same thing, and like all along the border, people did, couples meeting up, people singing happy birthday and all that stuff. So lots of people doing nice things. But I have to say,
that's cool.
It does make me wonder that if you were in the other side of the border, if I would come travel by down the border to have a conversation with you. I kind of think I wouldn't, because we do this already. Like, what's the in person going to add to it? Would you come see me at a border?
I would totally come see you at a border.
I don't believe you.
Absolutely.
I don't believe you. You're just saying that because I was honest and said that. I'd be like, yeah, the Zoom's enough, and I'm honest there. And then you're like, oh no, I would go travel to the border to hang out with you. I'm not so sure I buy it.
Well, I wouldn't now because I would have to get on a plane to do it, and that would be very.
You could lean into your ancestors, hop on a boat, do a little paddling, get on over to Western Europe, and then you have to follow some rivers, and I think you can get into Hamburg, and then once you're in Hamburg, if you can get past security, then that would be a border situation that might work out. So
you wouldn't like me to, you would not come visit me, but you would like me to get on a boat and embark on an epic journey to come visit you?
I'm just saying, it's if you want to lean into your ancestors and actually come through on your hypothetical, not necessarily desire, but that you're hypothetical. You're saying you'd hypothetically meet me at the border. You would put in that effort, and I'm saying that I don't know if I would. You're saying that you would, but now you're saying, oh, because there's an ocean, I'm not going to actually do it. I'm just saying you're like getting into your roots. You learning Norwegian. What better way to really dig into your roots than to traverse? I mean, they call it a pond for a reason, right? They say across the pond. I mean, like, how bad can the ocean actually be? Do a little paddling, get on over there, and then figure it out from there. And then see if you can really put your money where your mouth is.
Well, I have examples to follow because across the river in Moorhead, Minnesota, a guy from Holly, Minnesota, made a replica Viking ship and sailed that sucker to Norway. So I think probably I could just, like, with my free time, which is actually non-existent because I'm working and helping my kid with school, but in my hypothetical free time, I can take those plans and make my own Viking ship and come visit.
The real Viking thing for you to do would be to steal that ship, and you could bring your
that would be true.
Bring your kid along, and that's like you're giving him his heritage at a very young age. And you said he's like 7 years old.
He's almost 7.
7. Yeah, I mean, like, some memories at 7 are a little shaky when you get older, but I guarantee he'll remember the time that his Viking warrior mom took him to Holly, Minnesota to steal a replica Viking ship and sail it across the pond or the ocean, if you want to make it sound dramatic.
Well, Moorhead, technically, but yes.
Moorhead.
Yes, that time that my mom made me a Viking raider was the coolest thing that happened during the pandemic.
There we go.
Way cooler than lying around in his pajamas all day, for sure.
The Viking thing sounds like a lot of work. I kind of like pajamas. I might go pajamas. But then again...
Pajamas are much more accessible.
There we go. I think we need to get out of this. This turned nonsensical real quick. And on that note of Viking warrior versus pajamas, that's it for this episode of Travel Tomorrow. Thanks as always for tuning in. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do us a favor, not like you got much else to do right now, and rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts.
And if you want to connect with us, talk about what you liked about this episode, your favorite books to armchair travel during this crazy time of coronavirus, or you want to talk about what you want to hear in the next episode, go ahead and drop us a line. We're at traveltompod on Twitter, traveltomorrowpod on Facebook, traveltomorrowpod@gmail.com. And we want to thank the Fiddle Revolt for the theme music. And as always, you can subscribe to Travel Tomorrow wherever you get your podcasts.